Morning. A few years ago, my wife and I got to know a Turkish student called Figan. When Figan's sister came to visit her, the four of us went for a trip out to a country park. As we were walking along a path, a family group approached us, which contained children, including a toddler. Figan's sister swept the toddler up, kissed it, put it down, and said how beautiful she thought it was. And of course, all the Brits present were astonished and taken aback by this behaviour. There had to be a lot of explanation and assurance and apologies, but it was all smoothed over. Presumably in Turkey, that kind of thing is okay. It isn't here. That's a cultural difference. And if it happens here, it's unacceptable, and it creates a minor shockwave. The story we've heard today in John 4 contains, by contrast, a major cultural shockwave, far more shocking than a child being picked up and kissed by a stranger. I'm going to start today's talk by attempting to describe just how shocking it was and what that tells us about Jesus. And then Lynn is going to talk about more about the content of what Jesus said. The story contains, one after another, almost like repeat hammer blows, things you didn't do in first century Israel and Samaria. It wasn't that bad or exceptional that Jesus chose to walk through Samaria. The Jews and Samaritans hated each other, like Shia and Sunni in some parts of the world now, like Catholic and Protestant in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. But it was a shortcut, which was important for poor people like Jesus, who walked. And as long as you didn't have close contact with Samaritans, it was okay. You were probably safe. The Romans kept the peace. It was probably even okay for the disciples to go into town to buy food, so long as they avoided defilement, although it's not something a very religious Jew would probably have done. But the first line that was crossed was by the Samaritan woman. It was the 6th hour. That's about midday. Normally, respectable women went to the well in groups at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. Any woman going to the well on her own in the middle of the day was acting well outside normal cultural expectations. She would quite possibly meet strangers on her own. She was acting scandalously. She compounded this by carrying on towards the well when she saw Jesus there. And he was quite visible because he was sitting on the well, on the capstone, which is apparently visible to this day at Jacob's well. She should have stopped and let Jesus withdraw to a distance of at least 20 feet. Doubly scandalous. Then Jesus gets in on the act. He doesn't withdraw 20 feet. Now he is behaving scandalously. Then it gets worse. The fourth untoward event, it is that he starts talking to her. This is really bad. He breaks the social taboo about talking to women in public. And she is a Samaritan, and she is clearly a, if you like, bad woman. Whatever else is going on, these two human beings are not risk averse. They are operating outside the rules. So where are we up to? About 6 dodgy angles so far? It's worth noting in passing that Jesus starts to relate to the woman on the basis of his ordinary everyday need, of weakness. He's thirsty. It's a quiet, humble human beginning to a conversation which contains mind-boggling cosmic stuff. And Lynn will say more about this in a minute. The 7th disgraceful thing is that Jesus is prepared to drink from the woman's container. Back then, travellers carried their own collapsible leather containers to avoid defilement. Presumably, the disciples had taken the team bucket into town, into Sychar, but that didn't bother Jesus. He was relaxed about becoming defiled. Disgracefully, Jesus extends the conversation and treats the woman as an equal participant in a serious spiritual discussion. It gets worse all the time. Lynn will be saying more about the content of this extraordinary conversation, but note that it contains Jesus' first ever recorded I am statement. Given the importance of his various I am statements, note that he picked this conversation for the first. Then when the disciples come back, they marvelled. They were astonished at what they found. Well, they might be. But Jesus showed no shame. no embarrassment. I wonder whether the disciples approached her or talked to her, but the gospel is silent on that point. Surely they must have done sooner or later, and it may well have been comical to see them overcoming their initial discomfort and reluctance. The woman then leaves her jar. It was only an excuse to meet someone interesting after all, and tears off into town, becoming the world's first female Christian preacher. She must have done a good job, because everyone from town comes out to meet Jesus. And now the final scandalous thing. They invite Jesus back to town, and he accepts. What did the disciples make of that? He stays 2 nights. For any Jew, this was inconceivable and would leave you deeply defiled in a society obsessed with being defiled and avoiding it. For a rabbi, it was inexplicably disgraceful, and it's perhaps no wonder it never got into the earlier Gospels. And then a final twist. Who are the first people to recognize Jesus as the Saviour of the world and name him as such? The despised Samaritans. Everyone will have their own view, but could I suggest that Jesus knew precisely what he was doing and stage managed the whole thing? He wanted to make a number of important points about God's kingdom. Defilement doesn't matter anymore. Race should no longer divide people, and an international vision was needed. Women and men are equal. It is their basic humanity that matters. Everyone deserves respect, and the way to show it is to spend time with people. He was proclaiming all this loud and clear by his scandalous, rule-breaking actions. But what was he saying? Over to Lynn.
Dave's brought his picture, and I brought an olive wood sculpture there, which I haven't had 40 years, but I've had it a number of years. And it really attracted me, because I think that the woman there, she looks very strong, but also there's like a humility about her, and I was really drawn to it. I don't know if it is this woman of the well, but it is to me, and it is for today. As David said, he had the picture at our Soul Friends group, and the woman at the well obviously is a really familiar story to all of us, so when you look at the picture you actually know how it's all going to end, and I think that sort of adds to that feeling of expectation and a sense of something about to be revealed. And what I noticed is that this revelation is incremental. It's like a step-by-step thing, so that you move from ordinary chit-chat to some profound theology. And the woman herself, she moves from being very guarded and suspicious with Jesus to complete open-heartedness and trust. There's so much in this chapter that all I could do really was just pull out a couple of threads which hit me, really. David mentioned about Jesus coming not from a place of strength. As he said, it's likely that him and the disciples, they had a portable bucket for getting water. And even though Jesus was the one that stayed by the well, he clearly didn't have the bucket with him. And there's no way at noon in Palestine he wasn't going to get thirsty. So he put himself deliberately in a place of needing service from another. He chose to be dependent on somebody else's ministries. And this is a principle that you can find elsewhere in the Bible, because when Jesus sends out all the disciples on their mission, they're not allowed to take money or a bag or an extra tunic. So he's making it so that they will be dependent on people that they meet along the way. So he doesn't allow them to be self-sufficient in terms of their material needs. And of course, Jesus being born in this world as a baby is the ultimate in being dependent on other people. So by being in need and choosing not to have the means to satisfy that need himself, Jesus demonstrates a model that is quite different from that of giver giving from a position of strength, with a receiver receiving from a position of weakness, with the traffic only flowing in one way. I've just been reading this big thick book by Kenneth Bailey, and he lived in the Middle East for over 40 years, so he's steeped in Middle Eastern culture. And he also uses for sources some 11th and 12th century Middle Eastern writers, and their writings are not available to us because they're not been translated into English. So using them, he really gives you some insight from a Palestinian cultural perspective into Jesus' parables and teachings and his life events. It's really quite interesting. But anyway, in the book, with regard to the woman in the well, he quotes a Sri Lankan theologian called Daniel T. Niles, and this is what he says. Jesus was a true servant because he was at the mercy of those whom he came to serve. This weakness of Jesus, we, his disciples, must share. To serve from a position of power is not true service, but beneficence. I'm going to say it again because I think it's quite important. Jesus was a true servant because he was at the mercy of those he came to serve. This weakness of Jesus, we, his disciples, must share. To serve from a position of power is not true service, but beneficence. Now, I'm not sure that there's anything wrong with beneficence, because I think it means something like well and kind doing. But it seems to me that Christian service is about more than that. And I think it's actually really challenging, especially in our way of being self-sufficient and independent. In fact, I think it's almost unthinkable, really. And not only does Jesus put himself in need of service, but needing the services of an immoral foreign woman from the enemy camp. The situation, the scenario that they're in, really is something that would never even be ever going to happen according to the Samaritans and the Jews. If the Jews, they just wouldn't be in this situation. Which is why the woman is very suspicious and leads her to say literally to Jesus, "Why are you, a Jewish male, talking to me, a woman, a Samaritan woman?" She obviously thinks there's more to this than a bloke just wanting a drink. And there is more to it, but not in the way she thought. Jesus doesn't respond to her suspicions, though. Having got her attention, he begins to share with her some new and exciting truths. The woman is all ears when he describes living water available for all. And although she takes it literally, she focuses on what Jesus has to offer that can benefit her. How can I possess some of that? How can I use it to make life easier for myself? Of course, this is how many of us do approach religion in the first place. How's it going to help me? How can my life be easier or happier, or how can it make me feel better? And again, that's fine, but it's only the first half of what Jesus was saying to us as well as to her. Because he goes on to talk about people becoming springs of water in themselves, which is for the benefit of others, which is eventually what happened to the woman, that she does become a spring of water herself for the people of her village. In the next part of the conversation, subtly, the lifestyle of the woman is brought out into the open. And I love what she does with this. The subject's far too uncomfortable. I can imagine her thinking, how can I get this man sidetracked and get the spotlight off me and my personal life? I know, she thinks, I'll get him to debate religion. That'll do the trick. So to escape from the business of looking at herself, she comes up very quickly with a controversial religious issue that has been rumbling on for 500 years. I don't think she really expected an answer, but her question was, what is the proper place for people to worship? Mount Gerizim, which is holy to the Samaritans, as this is where Jacob had his vision, or Jerusalem, where the temple was. The question implying, really, which group can lay claim to God's favour. Despite the woman's reasons for posing this question, it does become an opportunity for Jesus to announce a whole new understanding of God and who are God's people. Jesus goes way beyond the narrow understanding of both Jews and Samaritans, where one group is chosen to the exclusion of another. And he incorporates both groups into his wide vision of the inclusions of all peoples. Either or becomes both, and. As David said, Jesus' final words to the woman just before the disciples come back are, I am. And according to Ken Bailey, the Greek word is the same that God uses to Moses at the burning bush. So I think the encouragement of this encounter to us all is the fact that a Samaritan woman of doubtful morals, who was bantered with Jesus from the beginning of the encounter, becomes the person who is privileged with the ultimate revelation of who Jesus is. I've just got a few questions, or sort of, if you want to split into groups of 3 or 4. The first one really is just a general one. Is there any part of this encounter which resonates with you? And then, particularly, can you think of any cultural rules that you have broken or will be prepared to break to express God's kingdom? And also, the third one is, how do you react to the suggestion that we, as disciples of Jesus, are to be at the mercy of those we serve? And how might this be done?